On this episode of China Uncensored, a shining example of how democracy works in China. Welcome back to China Uncensored, I'm Chris Chappell. Who says China can't have democracy? Certainly not my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times. As they point out, democracy is prospering under the glorious one-party rule of the CCP. I mean, Chinese democracy is banned, but I assume that was just a matter of musical preference. Other than that, democracy is doing great in China. And of course, there's no better example than Wuhan, located in Guangdong province. It's sometimes referred to as China's democracy village, which is way better than being known as China's underwear town, and yes, that is an actual thing. For decades in Wuhan, local officials had been getting rich off stealing villagers' land and selling it to developers. But in 2011, residents took to the streets, protesting to get rid of the crooked village leaders. And in a surprise move, then-Party Secretary of Guangdong, Wang Yang, resolved the protests not with tear gas and tanks, but by letting the villagers hold open elections. And they ended up voting 7 of the protest leaders into office. Technically, village elections have been allowed in China since the late 1980s, but elections are often managed by the local party secretaries, so truly meaningful elections are rare. Funny how that happens. So actually, in Wuhan, it seems the Communist Party did a great thing. Instead of turning to violence and repression, they experimented with greater democratic reforms. Now you might be thinking, Chris, in 5 years of hosting China Uncensored, this is the first positive thing you've ever said about the Communist Party. Yes, I've certainly changed my tune, which is why the rest of this episode is just pandas frolicking in the snow. Okay, that's enough of that. Wuhan was such a success story back in 2011. Let's see what's happening in Wuhan now, in 2017. Oh, this seems like a good sign. A giant billboard with doves flying over Tiananmen Square, while armed soldiers look on. It says, "Advance solidly to execute the strategy of loving the people and enforcing the border. Police and citizens collectively build a harmonious and civilized Wuhan." Well, that sounds lovey and dovey. But enforcing that border is important. Otherwise, dangerous elements could sneak in, like reporters.
Today, Wuhan is sealed off by checkpoints and armed police.
Well, one Reuters reporter did sneak in, and this is what he observed.
Every street corner, from accounts that I've heard, have video cameras now, high-definition surveillance cameras. There are plainclothes police everywhere, and there's still a massive battalion of riot police.
Now, while that sounds bad, there's a very good reason for the heavy police surveillance. You see, there have been some problems in Wuhan. Last year, the leader that villagers elected, Lin Zuluan, was frustrated. Even though he got elected, communist officials at every level were blocking him from carrying out the changes they had promised him 5 years earlier. So he threatened to bring the villagers out to protest again. But instead of giving in to his threats, authorities simply arrested him and forced him to confess to a bunch of corruption charges. Then the villagers protested that, and the CCP responded in pretty much the way you'd expect. And now, a year later, all's quiet on the Wuhan front. According to one of the former protest leaders, all of the other former Wuhan protest leaders have since quit their jobs, been jailed, or harassed. The only possible explanation is that they were all bad leaders. See, Chinese people just aren't ready to elect their own representatives and need the strong, benevolent hand of the CCP to pick their leaders for them. Jackie Chan was right all along. And really, how could the man who made both Shanghai Noon and Shanghai Nights ever be wrong? But back to Wuhan. It's not just the protest leaders who have gotten in trouble. Ordinary villagers were sentenced to prison for illegal assembly, disrupting traffic, and spreading false information. So it seems we're back to the status quo. It really was the perfect strategy from the CCP. Pretend to give in to people's demands, allow elections, then undermine those elected leaders at every opportunity, then eventually arrest those leaders and establish a police state. And who's making that police state possible? The West is, I guess. Now, it's interesting to note that Wang Yang, the Guangdong Party secretary that allowed for elections in the first place, has recently been promoted to the Politburo Standing Committee. One of the 7 most powerful men in all of China. Maybe that means he'll push for democracy in the rest of China. After all, I hear democracy is flourishing in Wuhan. What do you think? Leave your comments below. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. So maybe you can't vote in China, or protest, or watch this YouTube video. But for the 99% of you not illegally watching this with a VPN in China, remember, you can and should go to ChinaUncensored.tv to watch new, full half-hour episodes every Friday. Check it out, ChinaUncensored.tv, or just click the square button.